what are we doing in LA Unified this year? Well, we've been doing a lot of work around what we talk about in terms of educator effectiveness. And when we think about educator effectiveness and we talk about it at the school district, we think about three main reasons why this is important, whether you're talking about teachers or principals or other administrators or other educators throughout our system. Key and chief among them is actually, it's not about developing evaluation and effectiveness measures to judge, but it's actually improvement is the key lever that we're looking for. And again, chief among the reasons for doing anything like this is to identify, celebrate, learn from excellence. We know there's fantastic work going on, despite what you read too often in some of our local papers. There's fantastic work going on in classrooms across our district, across the state. We don't spend enough time understanding more about that and learning from it, and holding it up and saying, what is going on there, and how can we learn from it and accelerate that work across our district? This concept that we're lifelong learners. Everybody can always get better. And finally, if you think about salaries and benefits in a school district, 80 to 90% of our budget goes to salaries and benefits. We take taxpayer money and we translate that into salaries and benefits. And we have a responsibility to make sure that there's a quality control function that we actually provide and serve. But what is it really about? That what we're doing is really trying to deliver on what we believe is the fundamental right of every child, every student in the district, to be in front of an effective teacher every day, to be in a school run by an effective leader, surrounded and supported by an effective team of educators. Little over a year ago, we ended a process called this Teacher Effectiveness Task Force, a misnomer in that the task force was actually given the charge of coming up with recommendations for teachers, principals, administrators, support personnel, all around not what actually started out as a discussion about dismissals, but what are we doing across somebody's career? What are we doing to grow, develop, support people throughout their career with us? This group came up with a set of recommendations. It was a broad stakeholder group. Not everybody agreed with every recommendation, but broadly there was this agreement that we needed a multiple measure evaluation system for teachers and school leaders, that when we talk about differentiated compensation, well, we do it now, but we don't always do it based on performance. We don't do it based on what we need, and we don't offer people enough opportunities to stay in the classroom, yet have additional opportunities to either earn more money, earn recognition, get other opportunities professionally to grow. Anybody who's been a teacher knows that currently the system is everybody goes to the same professional development, whether you're good, bad, or indifferent at a skill. And this group said, make sure that when you do a new evaluation process, it's actually about targeting support for the individual needs of that teacher, of that administrator. And lastly, some ideas around changing some legislative structures that would allow us to think differently about layoffs and dismissals. We turned that into a three-phased plan, taking the first year, which we're ending right now, to design and build, to research and develop our multiple measure evaluation system, and also an aligned development process, an individual growth planning process for our educators. Going into a second year, which would be a field test year, which I'll talk about momentarily, and then being prepared in another year to go to scale. So, I hope you all can see this and you'll be able to see it your leisure on your computers later, but multiple measure evaluation system for us really is about, mostly about observation of practice. Chief, biggest measure we're talking about is this observation of practice. by administrators and by other teachers, teacher leaders, opportunity for growth and career ladders, career pathways, stakeholder feedback, contributions to school community, contributions to student learning outcomes, all linked again to this idea of individual growth planning and individualized support for teachers. At the bottom here, we have a teaching and learning framework. And this really is the core of what we've started to do for teachers, and then similarly for leaders, a school leadership framework. And I'm not going to replay a slide just to switch out school leadership in here, but imagine the same set of measures for school leaders based on frameworks that people define, where we can define a common understanding of what we're looking for from our teachers, our leaders, and others in the system. We started to develop this over the last few months, working on this teaching and learning framework, that if we do our job right, and we train people on what are you looking for in the classroom when you go to observe, and dial down the subjectivity, but bring up the inter-rater reliability, the understanding, the norming, the training of our observers, whether they're principals, teacher leaders, or others, we can go straight at a trust issue that we all know exists in observations and evaluations of teachers. Whether or not the person coming in to look at me as a teacher knows what they're looking for and is fairly and understandably trained, and I know what they're looking for as a teacher. I'm going to pause here and ask Kyle to come up and comment on this, as Kyle is a member of our ad hoc committee on the teaching and learning framework, just to talk about his reactions to that.
Thanks, Drew. I got to work on the development of this teaching and learning framework, specifically about how some of the language was developed in this. So I just want to make a few comments about how the teachers in LA Unified got involved, and then what are some of our hopes for this thing, and then what are some of maybe the concerns that teachers are thinking about right now. Basically, we all came together in a giant room with food and drinks provided, which was very nice, and talked with other teachers and administrators and parents and other community and education advocates, and we really talked about the difference between, for all of these different categories, for dozens and dozens and dozens of specific elements. And it was really an activity in going from how do we go from vague language to specific language? And that was a really, really powerful tool to get teachers involved in that. In conversations with other teachers, we looked at this and we said, you know, there's some really, really hopeful elements about a framework such as this. Number one, you probably can't see it, but you can look at the different categories, specifically effective and highly effective, and as a teacher, simply reading that will give me something to shoot for, something to aim for. It's my summer, it's my prep time. Let's take a look at what I want to do this year. What are my goals? Well, if you look in the right-hand column, it says, you know, students formulate many questions to advance, students themselves, formulate many questions to advance their own understanding. Maybe that's something I want to work on this year as a teacher. This is a good way to do that. Another thing that we're hopeful about, and I'm hopeful about, is to use this as a powerful piece for professional development. If you speak with any teacher, they'll tell you that they've been in professional developments that are awful. And this is something that we could actually take and say, how do we give PD to teachers so that we can learn how to teach students to formulate their own questions? That's an important piece of this too. And then the other thing we're sort of hopeful about this is that this will give the district another tool in the conversation of how do we evaluate a school as a whole. Right now, you know, districts are very invested in evaluating and categorizing schools. This is another piece of that puzzle, and it's an important piece of that puzzle to what's going on. A couple last comments, and then I'll turn it back over to Drew, is that one of the things that the teachers and myself as a teacher are wondering about this is essentially how this is going to play out in classrooms. And if you are observing me, are you observing me effective the same way that you are observing me effective, the same way as you are observing me effective? And those are important points to consider as well. The other important part of this is this is really important to do, and it's going to take a lot of time and energy and effort, especially from the people who are observing. So right now, our school has, we have a principal and 2 assistant principals who are stretched so thin, and we want them to be in classrooms doing this more. We want them to be giving us pre-observation conferences, being in our classroom not just once, but many times throughout the year, and giving us constant feedback and ways to improve. So I'm not sure what that means for funding, but that would be an important component of making sure that something like this is going to work for LA Unified.
I want to talk at least a little bit about what we call academic growth over time. For you Prince fans in the audience, this is the measure formerly known as value added. We really, this is the contributions to student learning outcomes measure, which will be, and we always see this and have been very clear about, a fractional part of the evaluation picture and more of a tool and an extra data point that we should be looking at. We shouldn't only be looking at test scores and the way we evaluate and look at and assess growth over time, but we shouldn't be ignoring it either. There's some powerful stuff in this idea of growth. Right now we have, usually we look at schools, we look at growth of groups of students just looking at attainment or achievement goals, and we don't look at schools or groups of students by their growth and how much they're actually growing. It doesn't tell the whole story. You're comparing apples to apples or oranges to oranges rather than looking at a cohort, a group of students from last year that was in one grade and then the next grade of students and looking at that comparison. If you think about what one could use and should be using information like this in concert with achievement and attainment goals, this is a compass. It doesn't tell us what's going on in a classroom. Whether you're looking at something that has a high growth over time result or a low growth over time. But it's pointing us in a direction to say, what's going on there and what can we learn? Either what can we learn and figure out how to intervene and help and support, or what can we learn and figure out how to spread that across? It also, again, fills in this picture and enables us to start to look at isolating impacts within schools. So this year, we have spent this year, and started on this work actually even before the LA Times released its first set of information at the end of last summer. But we approved, our board approved a contract with the University of Wisconsin Value-Added Research Center to develop our academic growth over time measures. In the early part of this year, we did a lot of training of school leaders, of teachers, of others throughout the system about the new measures. In March, we gave principals the school level results so they could understand how to work with their teachers and other stakeholders. And then in April, we publicly released the school level results. Later this month, we will be confidentially, only to teachers, releasing teacher level results for some grades in some subjects, because we don't have results for all the grades or all the subjects. And we can talk more in the Q&A about some of the challenges there. But we think this is important to do in context rather than putting it in, I'll go editorial here, but rather than putting it in a newspaper without context and without questions and thought-provoking things, but to give questions and give people the tools to understand what it is and what it isn't. We feel like it's key and critical. With that, let me ask Kyle to talk a little bit about what you see here is an example of a school-level report for English language arts and math. Gray means we're not quite sure if it's enough to be a green or a blue, which is where you're headed for in terms of the higher growth, higher than predicted. Again, value-added academic growth over time looks at, based on past scores, where is each student expected to score in the coming year, and then backing out of that to understand what is the impact of a teacher or a school. So Kyle.
So ever since the LA Times published their article in August, the term value added has been anathema to many teachers. And my colleagues at my school know that I've been in conversation with folks at the district who are developing academic growth over time or value added. And so Drew asked me to make a few comments about what has been the teacher reaction to this, which is a version of value added. I would say that at my school, the idea has gone from initially very skeptical to now, after a couple months of conversation, cautious optimism. Some of the concerns that our teachers had were the same concerns that I'm sure you've heard about how valid is it to use one test to do something like this, or how objective is the analysis of value added if you're making decisions about which variables to include or not to include. And then there's the whole issue of how that gets publicized or not publicized, and how does that affect morale. But in the last couple months talking with teachers, that has moved very, very progressively to a cautious optimism about it, in looking at ways that this could actually help teachers get better, which is the point. One, we were able to, when we got our school, we were actually able to look at some specific grade levels where we did some specific interventions, specifically in a 6th grade math class, and we saw a much higher value-added score than some of our other scores, and that instantly tells us, hey, your intervention is doing something that's working. Maybe that's something you want to keep as a teacher or a school. That's a positive that teachers bought into pretty quickly. Another thing is that this gives us a tool to actually talk to other schools without making, I don't want to say making excuses, but without writing things off as, oh, they serve a different population, or, oh, you know, their kids are bussed in, or whatever. Whatever, we can, like Drew said, we can compare apples to apples here, and we can actually learn from each other, and I can go to another math classroom and say, you know what, you have really good AGT scores. What are you doing differently that I can learn from? And teachers have slowly become optimistic to that. Another thing that, that schools and teachers have become more optimistic about this is how this information changes the way that schools as a whole are perceived. Like Drew mentioned, you know, he mentioned that there are some schools with high achievement, but who have, you know, aren't progressing like we'd want them to. Similarly, there are schools that get overlooked who are progressing their students wonderfully, and something like AGT shows that. And then again, once they've seen the framework of, you know, this is just a fractional piece, teachers have tended to be very much open to this idea and excited to participate in the conversation.
So I'll go somewhat quickly. I'm going to take like 5 more minutes just to run through. I'm going to steal 4 extra minutes to run through our other measures and just tell you what we're doing next, and then at least leave you with a little bit of context and thought about the policy implications for all of you in this room. Last 2 measures that I want to point out here. One is stakeholder feedback, which is the idea of involving in this game directly from our task force, and it's something that's being tried out in many different districts across the country. This idea that students and parents or guardians and others, when you're thinking about teachers and principals, and then when you're thinking about principals, having students, parents and guardians, and teachers, having stakeholder feedback be a part of the discussion around evaluation. And this isn't saying you want a 4th grader to then evaluate whether or not I, as a teacher, have the correct pedagogy, but there are some key questions that we know, whether you're in 4th grade or 12th grade, actually correlate. If you're looking at what's happening in a classroom, looking at what a student is saying, there's some exciting research out there right now that's showing that those things correlate to gains for students if they're reacting to things like strong leadership. This is where teachers tend to stay in schools: strong leadership, inclusive leadership, collective responsibility. For students, they're learning more in classrooms that have respectful environments, academically ambitious instruction. What you'll see when you look at this afterwards is there are some items you can start asking, and these are already being tested out around the country, and we'll be testing some of these next year, asking students, parents, and teachers to see how these show up and how they do correlate to success for students. Last measure is this idea of contributions to school community, which probably will wind up as some sort of a 360 evaluation process where other teachers can sound off and have a voice in what the school community is feeling like. Key among all of this, obviously, is this development support. This idea that individual growth planning process is the lever we're actually going for. It's not the evaluation and measurement, because we can measure 17 different ways. It's what do you do with that information? Do you actually target support and development opportunities for teachers, for principals, for other educators, based on what you're learning from where people are along the performance continuum, or their continuum as an educator. Next year, we will be moving into what we call this initial implementation phase, a learning year only, no stakes, for voluntary teachers and schools throughout our district. Just to clarify, there is no negotiated agreement. We're actually in negotiation discussions with many of our labor partners, and evaluation likely will be part of that. But there's no negotiated agreement. This is a professional development opportunity. This is a learning year, a voluntary process where we'll be testing out these measures and this growth planning process to learn, to really field test, to kick the tires, understand what works, what doesn't work. And just this week, we got back our responses from schools volunteering, and over 100 schools have volunteered. Close to 1,000 teachers have asked to be part of this piloting year, which will be several observations throughout the year. We'll be thinking differently, not using, but thinking differently about how you include data elements in your planning process as an educator. The response, as I said, has been strong. Again, it's this idea of improving, not judging, and building the system with our stakeholders. Before I turn it over to Kyle to talk a little bit about this piloting process for 1 minute, I promise, I did want to talk about just our legislative agenda that we built as a result of going through that task force process. One is just looking to the state to set some broad parameters, not tell us how much, what percent, what weight, but set some broad parameters around what should be involved in the performance review process and let us figure it out locally in terms of what the actual puzzle looks like when you put it together. But making a statement from the state level. Also, there was broad, not universal, but broad agreement at our task force that tenure or permanency needs to be a longer window to make it more significant. It's fair to the teachers, it's fair to the schools, it's fair to the kids. 1.5 years, which is what it functionally becomes, this task force didn't believe was enough time. The last two things were just thinking differently about layoffs and thinking differently about dismissals. A lot of those hinge on being able to evaluate the right way and building a system that actually grows people and doesn't just look to be punitive and provides the tools for schools and school districts to make thoughtful decisions. So with that, let me just have Kyle talk a little bit about the pilot process for 1 minute, I promise.
So when I shared with my teachers at my school that we had a chance to pilot this new evaluation system next year, and I framed it as this is a chance for improvement versus a chance for judgment, people jumped. In 48 hours, I had completely filled up all the people that we could fill up for the number of administrators we had at our school. So I was thrilled about that. And it was not surprising at all to me to see how many teachers really jumped at the idea of getting a chance to get some really constructive feedback. For us, for so long, and for me and myself, we've worked in a system where we had an administrator come in maybe once a year, and he would come in for about 5 minutes with a clipboard, check, 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 you're good. And that was it. And I felt very, very secure in my job, but I wasn't getting any better. And my colleagues feel the same way about that. And so given the chance to jump on a voluntary pilot program where there were no stakes attached, but you were given a chance to improve rather than being judged, teachers really responded to that. And then secondly, teachers like giving input in the process at the district level. And you know, one of the realities is that this is something that is most likely going to, you know, for sure going to get rolled out eventually. And given the chance to be part of the conversation, to frame how it works and what teachers feel about it and how they responded to it, teachers really want that opportunity to say, all right, come in and observe me, we'll test this out, and you know what, these things I liked about it and these things I didn't like about it. And then the district can take those and tweak it and make it even better. So that something like performance evaluation cannot just be about judgment, or not be about judgment at all, but be about improving and getting better. And when teachers really understand that, and when teachers get that, it's something that teachers really, really feel excited about and want to be part of.